And Buzz Myers. Up, see now, can't lie. All right. So this recording will be posted on the webpage with all the other things about the amendments in a few days. And then other things regarding Zoom, if you can, please stay muted unless you wish to speak. And if you have a comment or question that you want to share aloud, please raise your hand using the reactions panel, so I'll see that right away. Or if you want to put something in the chat, feel free to put things in the chat too, comments or questions or anything, and I'll try to keep an eye on that as well.
Yes.
So any other Zoom housekeeping things before we get started? Okay, I don't see any. So let's open with a word of prayer. Let us pray. Holy and gracious God, I give you thanks for this gathering of your saints as we seek
earlier in the week, I guess,
to find what it means to be reformed and always reforming in terms of our processes and the ways that we want to have a structure, and we also want it to be flexible. We want it to be timely. We want it to reflect who we are and whose we are in this place and this time. So I pray that you would help us to guide this conversation, and may it be meaningful to all who are participating. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, well, I am going to share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint to share, and if you've watched any of those videos that I've put together, this is going to look pretty familiar to you. But it's just going to be quick and easy. I just want to talk about briefly, go through like within 15-20 minutes or so, what the amendments are about, where they come from, just a little bit of background. So, the national body of the Presbyterian Church is called the General Assembly, and the General Assembly meets every 2 years. And when it met in 2022, there were a lot of overtures that were brought before the assembly. So people that wanted like different actions to be taken by the whole assembly. And at the end of that process, at the end of the week of debating and talking about different things, the General Assembly came up with 33 amendments to the PCUSA Constitution that have been drafted for our consideration. And now it's our work as a presbytery, as it is so with every other presbytery in the United States, to look at these amendments and to vote on the amendments and then return those results to the General Assembly so that they can determine which ones are going to be adopted as part of our Constitution and which ones will not be adopted as part of the Constitution. And we have to vote by July 9th, 2023, and have our votes submitted to the General Assembly. And our meeting time to vote is on April 18th at 6:30 p.m. There's a special presbytery meeting that's been called so that we can vote on these amendments. And I'm hoping we'll be able to get everything finished that evening. And if not, we'll have our regular stated meeting on May 2nd. So if we have to do any additional work or cleanup work, I'm hoping that we'll be able to finish it by then. But part of this preparation, part of this meeting tonight is to prepare for April 18th. So hopefully we'll be able to get the work done that evening. So Constitution, I did just want to say something briefly about the Constitution. Those of you who are familiar will already know this, so bear with me. But the PCUSA Constitution is actually made up of 2 sections. There's the Book of Confessions and the Book of Order. The Book of Confessions are doctrinal statements of faith that have been formed over the centuries of Christian history. So it includes things like the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Westminster Confession, and most recently, the Belhar Confession. And the Book of Order is that spells out how we do what we believe. So the Book of Confessions kind of says, this is what we believe. And the Book of Order says, okay, well, this is how we're going to organize ourselves. This is how we're going to proceed based on these things that we profess to believe in the Book of Confessions. And the Book of Order has 4 sections to it. There's the foundations, governance, and I know I put government here, but it's governance, also worship, and then discipline. And this is how the 33 amendments are broken down. There are 2 amendments that address issues in the foundations section. There's 17 amendments having to do with governance, 9 amendments having to do with worship, and 5 having to do with discipline. And I want to pause here for a second and talk about our process on April 18th. What I'm thinking at the moment, and I actually have a working group of folks that are working with me to help develop this process along with council. But what I'm thinking right now is that we'll probably do 4 consent motions. So what that means is, like, the first consent motion would be to adopt the foundations amendments. So 22A and 22B, that would be the first consent motion. The second consent motion would be to accept the 17 amendments of the governance section. The next consent motion would be the 9 amendments under worship, etc. And the thing about a consent motion is that if anybody wants to pull one of those amendments out for individual consideration, anybody may do that. So the motion would be, I move that we adopt all 17 amendments as proposed by the 225th General Assembly, having to do with the governance section of the Book of Order. And 4 people might raise their hands and say, well, I want to pull 22G, I want to pull 22N, I want to pull 22O, etc. And so we would pull those for individual consideration, for individual motions to be addressed after we take on the consent motion. Does that make sense to everybody? Do you have questions about that? Okay. So that's the idea going into it right now. But as I said, tonight is one of those nights where we're going to see, well, is that sort of thing going to work well for us? And we're going to continue this conversation, I and the working group and council, until April 18th. Hopefully we'll have a pretty good process figured out by then. So the foundations amendments. The first 2 are 22A and 22B, and they have to do with inclusive language. This is going to be really brief. The 17 amendments having to do with governments, they address all those topics that you see on your screen: electronic meetings, sexual misconduct, boundary training. There's 4 having to do with boundary training. Having an anti-racism policy within the presbytery, severance packages for ministers of the word and sacrament. So there's a whole variety of things that are addressed by the 17 amendments for the governance section. Then for the worship section, there are 9 amendments having to do with baptism, with the prayer of thanksgiving that is offered after communion, with symbols of blessing that are offered at a time of ordination, having to do with household worship, etc. And then under discipline, there are 5 amendments that have to do with discipline. And I want to say a few words about this one, because Amendment 22G is actually a full rewrite, easy for me to say, a full rewrite of the whole Book of Discipline. And it would be called then Church Discipline instead of the Book of Discipline. And a task force has been working on this rewrite since 2016 with the intention to do the things that are listed there, to make this Book of Discipline more accessible, more understandable to people who really don't engage with that material very often. It enhances accountability of individuals and councils, expands the role of mediation, and provides more flexibility within the discipline of discipline. So if 22G passes, then that supersedes 22CC through 22FF. So those four amendments would be superseded by 22GG if that were to pass. If 22GG does not pass, then whatever our individual votes are on those other four, those would then be meaningful and important to the General Assembly. So that's all I have to share on the screen. Like I said, quick and dirty. It's the whirlwind summary of content and process for April. A lot of material. So now this is our time for conversation. What are your questions? What are your comments? What are your aha moments? Anything for the good of the assembly here and for my learning as well. Yes, Ed.
Crystal, do you know the 22C through 22F amendments in the section on discipline, are they encapsulated in the new 22GG?
Yes.
If for some reason 22GG goes into effect, will it also pick up whatever changes they were looking to make?
Yes. Yeah, those changes, they largely have to do with language, so instead of saying the accused, saying the accused person, that's one or two of them. And another one, I think has to do, well, now I ought to pull it up. Let me check just so I make sure I don't give you incorrect information. Right, so accused to the person accused. Yeah, one of them is grammatical changes to an existing provision of the rules of discipline. So that basically, that one just kind of goes away. And then another one would be to allow a disciplinary process to continue after an accused has renounced jurisdiction. So yeah, I believe that is also included in this new church discipline as well. There is a side-by-side comparison. So you could go ahead and pull out the specific sections that are addressed. If you look at the summary page, you'll see which sections are addressed by each amendment. And then if you go to the side-by-side comparison, you can see how that's addressed in the new church discipline.
Thank you.
Sure. And Bruce.
So I think most of these are pretty vanilla from my perspective, and I hope we just quickly pass through them with consent agenda. There's only one that I really would want to talk more about, and it has to do with Amendment I.
Mm-hmm.
Amendment I, which sets up a minimum or a standard call for pastors that would require, is it 12 weeks family leave? Across the board, across all presbyteries, it would be mandatory. And I wonder if you know any of the debate or discussion that took place with that, because I feel myself on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, I love that we are trying to recruit actively younger clergy of childbearing age. I think that's a wonderful direction for us to go. And I simultaneously worry that many small churches will have difficulties meeting that calling standard, and it might actually go against young clergy being called, saying, the PNC might say, well, we really like this candidate, but she's 30 years old. What are the chances that she'll be having a child while she's here? And how will we cover the pulpit, So we're kind of stuck somewhere. Do you know any of the conversation that's been going on about that particular amendment?
I don't, but you raise good points. I mean, all of the above are, you're right that this is something that would be difficult for small churches who are already struggling to be able to implement. So it's ultimately up to COM to put a policy together. So yeah, I'm not quite sure what that would look like and how we would be able to accommodate those smaller churches who might not be able to afford a 12-week leave. And that's not just family leave. It's not just for, a child being born, but it can also be, for some sort of medical difficulty as well. So it's not just the young pastors. It can be somebody my age too. Depending on their medical condition. But that's a good point, and I will put some work into learning more about that and finding out more about that conversation. And what I can do is put that information out on that frequently asked questions section on the webpage.
So if I understand you correctly, and thank you for expanding it, it's
Mhm.
not just family leave related to birth, but
Correct.
you're saying it would be family leave related to death of an elderly parent, sickness of an aunt that I need to go take care of. It would be pretty open-ended in terms of people could say, I need family leave for 12 weeks because mom is dying back in Arizona or whatever it may be.
Could be. Yeah. And I think COM, I don't know how much leeway COM has with developing that policy. But yes, it could also include those kinds of things. It's not just for adoption or birth of a child, is my understanding. Mhm.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah. And Dick.
About 6 months ago, there was an article in Presbyterian Outlook that listed about 10 different things that the General Assembly had done. And they were, in my opinion, somewhat incendiary. Not the changes that you've been talking about and that I can read, but basically declaring that Israel was anti-Semitic and that it was a terrorist organization. There was a discussion about gun violence. There was a litany of repentance. The family leave we just talked about, but immigration, that Presbyterian churches would become a sanctuary and accompaniment church, and reproductive justice, which was supporting the right of abortion, LGBTQA equity. And I'm just trying to figure out how this document, if it is, maybe it's just wrong, but I'm trying to see how this fits with what you're talking about.
That's a good question, Dick. And I wish somebody who had been at General Assembly were here to be able to say more about this. But my understanding is that those are policy papers. And I'm probably using a word that is not accurate, but those are not amendments to the Constitution. So the amendments to the Constitution are, these vanilla things, as to use Bruce's word, that we're voting on in April. But I have seen that list that you are talking about, Dick, and memory is just failing me right now as to what it's called and what the significance is. Because I also took a look at that and thought, oh my goodness, there's so much here. Were we to, go ahead and try to abide by all these things or have conversations about all these things, that would be very detailed, lengthy work. And yeah, that's not what we're doing right
Okay.
now. But
Okay, as long
but
as.
yeah, I know what you're talking about, and I'm
Okay.
sorry, I can't speak to exactly what that is and what that means.
Well, my concern is, whether I agree or don't agree with these things is really immaterial. But if this becomes something that we're going to vote on in the Carlisle Presbytery, my bet is that there would be a number of churches who would be seriously opposed to a number of these things. And I just want to know clearly what it is that we're supposed to be voting on. because I know that I am going to have congregation members who have read this and are going to ask some questions about it. So I'm willing to be patient now with the explanation you've given, but I'm troubled by it. I
Okay,
mean, not your explanation, but by having people understand what it is that is being proposed, which looks to me, after reading it, pretty technical, and then some things that look pretty philosophical. And I just think it's an issue we're going to have to be able to explain to people.
okay.
Okay, that's
Well,
it.
I appreciate you asking that. Yeah. And again, I'll look into it. That's why I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I will look into that and try to get something written about that so we can answer that question. You know, I'm fumbling around right now, so I want to be able to answer that better. So yes, thank you, Dick. All right. And for those of you who can see, Mittens is now helping me. Okay. Roz.
Yeah, I'm looking at the big fat glaze your eyes over document that was posted about the part on 22I. And yeah, they do talk about, there was something that was a policy definition at the General Assembly level that family leave was birth, adoption, or foster placement, leave to provide care to an ill or disabled family member, leave to heal following a loss or a tragic event. What I thought was interesting was that the Advisory Committee on the Constitution said it should not be in the Book of Order. It's a policy manual type provision rather than something that ought to be enacted at the Constitution level,
Okay.
which I thought was pretty persuasive, actually.
Okay. Well, that's certainly something to keep in mind.
It's on page 18 and 19 of the big fat glaze your eyes over document.
Which is the full text of the
Yeah.
amendments. Yeah. Otherwise known as the full text of the amendments, which is also available on that webpage. So yeah, that good. Thank you, Roz. So I suggest Bruce and others, to read those couple of pages that are written about 22I in that document as well. Thank you, Roz. And Dick, did you have another question or comment? No. Okay. Bruce.
Since this is a conversational Zoom gathering, I want to engage in both Roz's comment and Dick's earlier comment. I've been at probably a dozen or more General Assemblies over the years. So let me help explain
Thank you.
what Dick was asking about.
Good.
Basically, what Dick is reminding us is General Assemblies, when they make these controversial statements, are aware and instructed. We are simply saying at this time in our Presbyterian history, at this time in history of the world and our society, we at this particular gathering at General Assembly believe that we need to be repentant related to treatment of Israel. We need to, and we would advise congregations and churches to think more about these things. But the very next General Assembly can overturn it and say, we see this time in history differently than you saw the time in history 2 years ago, etc., etc. So all of that is fast moving and fluid, and it doesn't go out to the presbyteries for any kind of vote or consent or agreement. It's simply an ideology that says, we think theologically to be faithful. We at this particular gathering, we believe we are being faithful to the Holy Spirit to make this following statement. What we're voting on that goes out to the presbyteries are constitutional things that will go into documents that will guide us as we move forward for years to come and apply in all kinds of situations. Which now takes me to Roz's comment that I agree with, and that is my concern about I is that it seems to imply by putting it in the Constitution, this will now be mandated to all congregations that you must include these. There doesn't seem to be any flexibility, any awareness that, this can be a little bit fluid at times. This 2 weeks applies here, 4 weeks applies there, 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks. it just is an interesting way of codifying it that felt to me too strict and too tightening of the rules in ways that would leave a lot of our smaller churches floundering and struggling to meet these conditions. So
Mhm,
that's what I wanted to address on why I'm concerned about I. Thank
mhm. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that explanation about what I called policy papers. So
Yeah.
the ideology. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Roz.
Yeah, I'm looking, the language from the advisory committee on the Constitution. It's not as blunt as we have, said, this is going to play havoc with small churches that wouldn't be able to afford to do it, and it could be a two-edged sword. But they do say that it's administrative operational detail. Councils have a responsibility and should be trusted to adopt policies appropriate to their circumstances that support and nurture their members, family, and staff. So, what's good in Carlisle Presbytery may not be what's good in Philadelphia Presbytery or feasible.
Mhm. Okay. Other questions or comments? Yeah, Buzz.
I have a more mundane concern and one that directly affects me, being recently retired. I'm interested in knowing why they want to take away my honorary before retired title. What's the rationale for doing away with honorably retired?
The rationale behind it is that while some ministers are very honorable in their service and honorable in their retirement, there are other ministers of word and sacrament that leave under not quite so honorable terms. So the only status that is available as a retired person, as a retired minister, is honorably retired. So the rationale is to respect the fact that that perhaps there are some people who don't necessarily deserve that title of honorably retired. So then the person would simply be retired, is my understanding. And it looks like Cheryl, would you like to say more about that?
Well, just to say, nobody's title is gonna be taken away. I don't know.
Yeah, and right, thank you.
Those who
Right.
have been honorably retired will retain that, that title. It's a kind of a going forward thing, I believe.
You're correct. Yeah. So Bruce and Buzz, you made the cut. You are honorably retired. Unless I retire before July 9th, I'm not going to make it if it passes. So
Maybe we ought to consider taking away the title of minister instead, if they're dishonorably, maybe that's the title to be taken away.
Well, that might require a disciplinary process. And I think part of the thing was, at least what I read, is that sometimes a minister will retire instead of face disciplinary proceedings. So that was part of it. So
You
I don't know.
you can't face disciplinary things if you are retired.
Well, that the person would leave the church and retire. I don't know. Good question. I honestly don't know.
That's the
Didn't one of
jurisdiction.
the amendments make that change that we're going to vote on?
Yeah, I think it does. Actually, you're
It
right.
does. It
And
addresses
probably
that.
the whole church discipline addresses that as well.
Yeah, so now you
Yeah,
can.
right, because if you leave jurisdiction, yeah, that's right, because if you retire, then you've left jurisdiction in that instance, right?
So Buzz, let me just say, as someone who's been retired a number of years, I have never a single time referred to myself or heard anybody else refer to honorably retired. My wife just laughed when she heard about this and said, who would ever say, I am honorably retired as a Presbyterian pastor? It's like, for me and for most of us, it's a non-thing. It's like, why do we even have that word at all?
Well, I'm an academic and my title now is an emeritus. So that's a part of what you do when you retire from an academic institution. You get a title that is honorably retired. So I was just interested in that sort of, why are we taking that away? It does save some type. You don't have to have quite as long, saves you some printing expenses, but I didn't see other reasons for taking it away, but the explanation I will go with.
Mhm. And actually, that is something, I've been tracking a little bit of how this work has been going through the presbyteries, and that is one that has been lifted up as a concern. Why would you take away honorably? I'm honorably retired. Why would you take that away from me or from people who are, going to follow me? So that actually has been somewhat, of these 33 rather vanilla amendments, that's one of them that has raised a few eyebrows. Mhm.
Yeah,
Good
they should have
question.
followed the military example of having honorably and dishonorably. But even in that case, it requires a disciplinary action to be dishonorably discharged in the military.
Mhm. Right.
Bruce, I will just tell you that I demand that my wife recognize me that is honorably discharged. So honorably retired. I'm sorry.
Well, as long as you recognize her as likewise,
She is
she's
like,
also honorably retired. Yeah, Ed.
I was just clapping. I didn't have my hand up for a question.
Okay. Oh, I gotcha. All right. I didn't see closely enough. So what other questions do you have about these things? Do they all make sense to you? And to Roz's comment, this is something I did put up on the frequently asked questions part of the webpage, is I did put a summary of how the advisory committee was advising on each of these. And sure enough, yep, it says at 22I, nope, because it belongs in an operations manual, not in the Constitution. So there are a couple other ones where they advise against it, against adoption, like a 22T and U, also X and Y. So, no, that X and Y are no opinion. It's fine the way it is. And it has nothing to do with polity. So I guess they didn't care. But that resource is also available to you without having to look through the full text of the amendments. Go Penn State. Thank you, Bruce.
May I ask another question, Crystal? Where is the document that you are referring to that gives you the rationales and the recommendations?
Mhm. So if you go to the Presbytery of Carlisle website and look at stated clerk, let me just double check. Yeah, go to the stated clerk page. Under stated clerk, there is the GA amendments page. And on the GA amendments page, there are buttons. If you scroll about halfway down, and the first one says amendment full text, and that's the 135 page or 150 page document that has the full text of each amendment along with the rationale and the advice of the advisory committee and other entities, you know, as appropriate, also weighed in. So that's all there. Mhm. Okay. Well, if there aren't any further comments or questions, we could be here another 20 minutes and chat, or we can go ahead and sign off and go watch some Penn State basketball.
I did have a question.
What's that, Roz?
Though it's 22 double C.
Mhm.
It's one of the ones that would amend the existing book of
Mhm.
discipline or whatever it's called.
Yes.
It's fascinating. The original one is when jurisdiction ends. It says basically if a person renounces jurisdiction, the disciplinary proceedings are finished because they no longer are under jurisdiction. And this proposed amendment says, oh no, they can renounce jurisdiction, but we're still going to go forward with the disciplinary proceeding. It just made no sense to me whatsoever.
Okay. That those two things couldn't go together, that once you've renounced jurisdiction, you've renounced and.
Yeah, and
Sure.
that ends the
Mhm.
matter.
Mhm.
Because you're no longer, you know, you've left the field.
You know, you would fit in very well in the advisory committee on the Constitution because that was their advice as well. They said the church has no authority when someone has renounced jurisdiction. So, right. You can no longer go after that person.
So, Crystal, are you thinking in when you're grouping these in consent forms of following the recommendations of the committee, or you're just going to just do them all as put them forth as consent yes votes, or are you going to break them down into
That's a good
pull out the
question.
ones that are recommended no?
You know, that's a good question. And actually that would make sense to pull the ones where they advise no.
It may streamline things a little bit, for
Mhm.
you anyway, trying to manage people pulling things out.
Correct. Yeah.
If they're
Mhm.
following the advice of those that have studied these probably more than we have. I
Mhm.
have. Speak for myself.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Thank you, Ed. That's a good idea. I like that. And actually with a couple of them though, I wasn't clear, like 22E. And Roz, maybe you can read these for me, Roz, since you are an attorney and you can
Good
tell me
luck.
what the legalese says, but I read it and I was like, can't really tell, presents issues, but I wasn't quite sure where they landed on it, so. Anyway.
Let's see. That was page 12.
Mhm. And is that the honorably retired one?
Yeah.
22E? Okay.
In the rationale from the people that proposed it was what Crystal had said, not everybody who retires has done so under quote unquote honorable circumstances. So let's just call everybody retired so that we're not making somebody who was maybe borderline naughty look nicer than they were or something.
Mhm.
Committee says it presents issues Deleting honorably does not alter the substance of any constitutional provisions. I don't know. I mean, this was one of the eyes glaze over things that I read.
Okay. So they glazed over for me,
interesting,
glazed
though-
over for the attorney in our midst. That's good. Okay.
What's
Thank you.
interesting though is it says the previous GAs that there were overtures that presbyteries could elect to designate a retired minister as honorably as a sign of affection, or that there was some discretion there, but that they failed. So I don't know. It seems like the advisory commission is not really giving us a direction on this at all. They're just pointing out the pros and the cons, right?
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. The folks that I'm going to meet though with on next week, one of them was at the GA, so maybe he'll be able to speak to that a little bit more too, and give us some further understanding about that.
I was at the General Assembly. I was the YAB.
You were the Houston, yes, okay.
Yeah. This was a very large point of contention during plenary sessions. People were very, very upset about, the possibility of taking away honorably in front of retired. But the conclusion that I got out of the very, very, very long conversation that we had about this topic was, it's easier to just scratch away honorably than to let it be, a discretionary title. Were they honorable? Were they not? It seemed to be an easier route to just say everybody's retired, and that is great. But I don't know.
That
Well,
sounds.
that makes
about right.
sense, because then at the end of somebody's ministry, you don't have, and who decides? Does COM decide, oh, you're honorable, but you're not, or, and then making that distinction and having that be part of their permanent record.
Exactly. And then it would be,
Okay.
different between everybody. You might be honorable to these people's eyes, but you're not honorable to these people. It's a very weird limbo area to be in. So it was just easier from the way that it was explained to just say everybody's retired.
Mhm. Thank you, Kemper. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, in Carlisle Presbytery, we could put Buzz's wife in charge of making that designation.
I think that's a good idea, Ed. You're muted, Buzz.
In my situation, Carlisle Presbytery declared me retired before I was ready to retire. I retired from my job, but I thought I was still active in Presbytery. But I got a retired designation without even knowing that I was retired in light of from the Presbytery's perspective.
Okay, we'll need to talk
Would-
about
would
that. I
that-
was unaware.
Can I ask, would that be because, Buzz, that you retired? I mean, I presume you were in a validated ministry, right, as a professor?
No, I guess so, yes, because I had to fill
So
out.
if you retired from that validated ministry, then I think it follows that you're then honorably retired from the presbytery. Am I,
Yes,
help
but
me
the
polity people?
very fact that I had to fill out a form every year justifying my ministry
Mhm.
seemed to me that I was in a special category, that when I left that, I was still a member of Presbytery, an active member of Presbytery. So I was still I was doing things, and I am now. I'm a chair of CPM. I'm more active now than ever in Presbytery, but I'm considered retired.
Well, but you're still
It's
an active
just-
member of
it's
presbytery.
just
You're just
it's
your
just the
status is
title.
retired, right?
Okay, Cheryl wants to
Just a
say
second,
something.
there are two people talking. Yeah.
Sorry. I just was saying, it's just a title. It has nothing to do with your status as a member of the
Yes.
presbytery. Yeah, But I can understand where the confusion's coming from, so we'll have to work on that.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
informed by someone that I'd been retired by the presbytery after, I mean, I didn't know that was in the works. I knew that I'd retired from my position, but at the college, but I didn't know that the presbytery made that decision about me without my without consulting. I don't know.
Hmm.
I don't
Well, I apologize for that because maybe I did that. But let's talk about that offline.
That's, yeah, it's a
Yeah.
good point. But in other words, it's not only the honorably, it was the retired that sort of came as a shock to me.
All right. Other questions, comments,
Well, I just want to make
considerations?
one other quick point, and that is that Roz is not the only attorney at present here in the meeting. Elise Rogers here is also an attorney.
Sorry, Elise.
You outed me, Buzz.
I'm sorry, Elise. I'm sorry, but you're so good. You're so good. I knew that you would be reading these amendments and have comments to make if there was something out of order.
Mhm. My apologies to you, Elise. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. If you think of other things, John, did you have something or your hand's just up? Okay. Okay. Well, if anything comes up between now and April 18th, if you have some other ideas like Ed suggested of pulling, those amendments, the advisory committee say, to vote no on, which makes a lot of sense to me. If you have some other ideas around that, please feel free to contact me. I'm interested in hearing, your ideas and your questions. So, all right, we'll go Penn State, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you,
Crystal.
Crystal.
All right,
Great job. Thank you.
have a good evening.